This is Talk to Seattle, and I'm your host, Jason Rigden. On this episode, I have Brendan Kolding, who is running for Seattle City Council in the 1st District. How are you today?
Good, Jason. How are you doing this morning?
Doing pretty good. Could you tell me a little bit about yourself, maybe your background and experience?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Davis, California. I first moved to Washington to attend undergrad at Gonzaga, where I studied political science. Then I went out to Wisconsin. I got my master's in political science from Marquette University in Milwaukee. I returned to Washington in 2007, moved to Seattle, got an apartment on Lower Queen Anne. I had a job with the school district as a substitute instructional assistant, and I was eventually hired by the Seattle Police Department in 2008. I served just over a decade with the SPD as a patrol officer. I was in the North Precinct and the West Precinct, and I did 5.5 years at the headquarters building, which is downtown across from City Hall. I was in the policy unit for the entire duration of from when the city signed the consent decree with the Department of Justice all the way until we were deemed to be in initial compliance with that consent decree. And I actually promoted in place in 2015, so I was supervising the policy unit for a couple of years, 3 years actually. I promoted to lieutenant this past summer, went back to the North Precinct, and then earlier this year, I made the decision to resign from the SPD so I could campaign full-time, and so far that's been very beneficial for me.
So what made you decide to run for this office in particular?
Well, as a resident and as an employee of the city, and in particular as a police officer, I came to realize that we are in crisis. We are in a very serious crisis in the city of Seattle. Homelessness is out of control. It's causing a number of public health and public safety hazards. People on the streets aren't getting the services they need, in large part due to the fact that our city has been practicing a policy of false compassion for several years. Things have spun wildly out of control. If you look at documentaries like Seattle is Dying by Eric Johnson, if you read Scott Lindsay's System Failure, you can see that we are really at a state of crisis. And one part of that crisis is the fact that the SPD is losing officers faster than they can be replaced. And the reason for that is that they're not being supported by our city council. As the job gets tougher and tougher, as the officers feel less supported in their ability to do their job, they're determining it just isn't worth as much of the risk as it used to be. So we're experiencing a severe staffing shortage. With the staffing crisis that the police department's in right now, and with the general public safety crisis we're experiencing across the city, I determined that the best way I could help was to get on the city council, and the best way to do that would be to focus on campaigning full-time, which actually meant being another one of the officers who left SPD. But I really feel like in this way I'm able to really do the best I can to assist with this situation.
And could you tell me a little bit about your district?
So District 1 is West Seattle and South Park. It's unique in that it's actually a peninsula. It's Elliott Bay all the way around to the Duwamish Waterway, and then it becomes unincorporated King County south of that. So we're just the westernmost peninsula of the city. Best estimate these days is we have around 110,000 residents between the two communities, roughly 60,000 registered voters from what I understand so far. It's really a good place to live, a very high quality of life. It's long been one of the more affordable parts of the cities. Of course, that's been changing the last few years. It's a very strong community. There are a lot of people who have been here their entire lives. There are many families who have been here for generations. It's got a very strong character. And it will be a true privilege to represent this district on City Council.
And what are the biggest challenges facing your district?
So District 1 is not immune to any of the broader challenges that are facing the city. We have our issues here on the peninsula with homelessness and with public safety. What people who live here tell me are their most pressing concerns include the cost of living, traffic, and public transportation. Cost of living is something that we're, of course, experiencing across the city. But like I said earlier, we've gone from being one of the more affordable places to live, to buy a home for a new family to be able to start to accumulate their wealth and get their starter home and feel a sense of community in the home, to something that's more expensive and where that goal isn't as attainable for as many people as it used to be around here. Traffic, of course, is an issue throughout Seattle. One of our biggest challenges in District 1 is we are on a peninsula. We rely very heavily on the West Seattle Bridge. When traffic backs up there, you can actually feel the impact throughout the district. There are other options, but they're much slower or several miles out of the way. And then public transportation relates to that as well. There are many people for whom the various public transportation options that we presently have just aren't feasible. So they're forced to drive to work in traffic. And in general, that's their greatest sense of frustration out here.
And what do you think are the biggest challenges facing the city as a whole?
Well, homelessness and public safety and the various myriad issues that spin off from that. You go downtown, you see people living on sidewalks in tents. You see people living in parks. You see families living in recreational vehicles. You just see a sense of desperation and squalor that wasn't here 5 or 6 years ago. Related to that, the issues we're experiencing with mental health, with addiction, with crime are very apparent. It's very apparent that people have not been getting the services they need, that people's health needs have not been met. Many people are turning to crime in order to get by out there on the streets. It's a very intimidating culture in many parts of downtown for people. It's very detrimental to small businesses that are trying to survive. We've had businesses close. We've had businesses leave the city. And it all comes back to what I said earlier. It's been a policy of false compassion that the city council has claimed that by leaving people alone, by not doing the best we can for them to get treatment, somehow we're honoring their dignity, which simply isn't true. And it's not true for the people themselves who are living on the streets, nor is it true for the rest of the community. We're experiencing severe public health concerns. There's recently been a report that there's an HIV epidemic going on. We're at that level of crisis. The public safety, as I mentioned, has to do with the crime, but it also has to do with the fact that as the job of policing this city has become more complicated and riskier, and certainly involves a lot more calls to 911, City Council has been pretty aggressively anti-police in this respect. So officers don't feel supported. They don't feel like if they go out and do their job and they get a complaint, or they do something that's by the book within policy, that they won't get criticized for that. On top of the fact that City Council is not supportive of the police enforcing the law, they've determined that the job isn't worth doing anymore. So many of them are leaving or are applying to go to other agencies faster than their replacements can be hired. It's very difficult to recruit officers into the current environment as we have it. So it is a state of crisis. Our staffing levels are lower than they were 40 years ago, and the city is several-fold larger than it was in the late 60s. So to that respect, we're in crisis, and those are our two biggest challenges right now.
And how can the city help homeless folks?
So what the city needs to do is provide actual support to the homeless. We need to be okay with the fact that the current situation isn't working for anybody. What we need to do is establish a network of immediately available transitional housing options. I see this in part being something like FEMA-style tents scattered throughout the region. It doesn't have to be just within the city limits of Seattle. It could also involve the network of service providers we've currently been contracting with, but something that is guaranteed and immediately available and would have concentrated services. And I envision an intake and triage process where people could be sent to a facility that's best suited to their needs, whether it be substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, whether people have pets that they need to take with them, families with kids, people escaping domestic violence, even people who have just landed in the city and something didn't work out for them and they need a place to stay for the night. We need to make sure people are plugged into the appropriate facility with the right services to elevate them into a stable and dignified lifestyle. So on the one hand, you have that component. You have the guarantee of an improvement. of shelter and services. If people elect not to accept that, then we need to be comfortable enforcing the law. We need to explain to people if they're in a situation that would constitute criminal trespass, pedestrian interference, something like that. We need to explain that we're giving them another option, but if they choose not to take it, they have to either move along or they'll be subject to enforcement action, which is part of supporting the police. It's part of establishing a more productive and legal culture here in the city. And it's both carrot and stick. And I truly believe, and I've been criticized before for saying this, but I'm 100% honest about the fact that it is carrot and stick. That's what it's going to take to get us out of these states of crisis.
Another big issue is transportation. What can the city do to help improve our transportation system?
So we have a lot of options for public transportation. The biggest issue I've identified in talking with people is that for a lot of people, it's not feasible for them to take to work. It's too far of a walk to get from their home to the bus stop or the light rail stop or the water taxi. We need to look at creating routes that are accessible to more people. We also need to create routes that come more frequently. Some people don't want to get to work too early, but they can't get to work late. We just need to make sure it works for people. People will take public transportation if it's convenient for them and if it works. We also need to do things like incentivize carpooling. We need fewer single occupant vehicles out there on the road. Here in West Seattle, we have a unique situation with public transportation in that we're currently looking at various options for the Sound Transit light rail to come through. It's come down to between an elevated track right through West Seattle and a tunnel that would go under the Alaska-California junction and come out right at the north part of the peninsula there. And the community is very much in favor of the purple line, which is the tunnel. It would result in fewer homes being displaced by eminent domain. It would allow for more open space above the tunnel, and it would allow for more transit-oriented development because you're not taking as much space for the track. You're allowing more development there. So that's something that I definitely support.
Another issue that's on most voters' minds is affordability. What can the city do to help improve housing affordability?
Well, that's a good question. The first thing that I would like to do is revisit the MHA. The MHA was designed to create affordable housing through upzoning, and yet it's allowing developers to buy out of the obligation to create affordable housing by paying in lieu of fees. So in this legislation, we've created a huge exception that swallows the rule, which I find very discouraging. I don't know where the developments that would be funded by the in lieu of fees are going to be placed. The biggest concern I have about that is it could lead to gentrification if we have various affordable housing units placed rather than being scattered across the city where everyone can live and work and get to their jobs, because we have jobs of all income levels all across the city. If we push everybody into particular corners of the city, that wouldn't be good for our sense of culture or for our sense of equity. So basically, I believe we need to revisit the MHA. Part of the current legislation that's being considered by council is something called the Permanent Affordable Housing Program, which I think is a very interesting option that I hope to continue to consider, and I would consider if it's still on the table when I'm in city council. And what this would be is a community land trust where people would be able, when they want to put their homes on the market, to sell to this trust. And in exchange, they get a capital gains tax write-off, and those properties would be made available to sell at affordable prices. I don't know how those would be determined, but something lower than what it would be if it were just on the open market, for families to get their first home in West Seattle or elsewhere in the city and start to accumulate their wealth, to start to build in the traditional way of wealth accumulation that we've had across the country for many decades, and keep that option available for families. So I think that's very important. I was very fortunate 10 years ago when I bought my house. I was able to buy a very nice house in West Seattle for about half of what it's worth now. And I really feel like we need to maintain those options for families in the city.
We live in very polarized times. How would you as a city leader work to bring people together?
Oh, that's another great question. It all comes down to leadership. And I think what's exciting is when you look at 2020, we're going to have, I believe, a completely new council. We have 7 of the 9 seats up for election in November. I've spoken with candidates across the city. I think we're going to get a really good crop of people, a very intelligent, focused, reasonable group of people who are going to come together. We need to work collaboratively. We need to engage in intelligent conversation with each other. We need to not let partisan politics get in the way. We need to focus on the true values of our city. What I've found as I've been out in the community talking to people, because that's what I do. I go out and I talk to people all day long, and I've learned a lot about our city. And what I find encouraging is that most people in Seattle want to see the laws enforced. They want to see people get the services they need. They want businesses to be able to thrive. They don't want us to be overtaxed. They want really a very fair and just city. I don't believe that has been represented on city council, at least in this past term. But we can change that. We're going to get a good crop of people, and we're going to have to understand that we have a common mission. And as city council members, we need to see ourselves as public servants. We need to pay attention to people. There was that very well publicized incident at the city council meeting where the council members were staring at their smartphones as a gentleman was trying to talk during the open forum, which is a brief period of time during the day when the public is supposed to be able to address city council. The fact that the council members weren't listening to him tells me they're disconnected. They've checked out. We just need new people in there, fresh ideas, and people with a true sense of what it means to practice servant leadership.
And if people want to learn more about your campaign, where should they go?
Well, thank you. I have a website, brendankolding.com, BrendanKolding.com. I also am on Facebook, facebook.com/BrendanKolding1. And I'm on Twitter at Brendan Kolding. If you go on any of those platforms and you reach out to me, I'm good about responding. I'm very much interested in getting to know people, talking to people, hearing what issues are most important to my constituents. And I've really found that that's been a very productive means of communication so far.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
This has been Talk to Seattle, and I've been your host, Jason Rigden. If you want to support the show, why don't you follow us on social media? We are at Talk to Seattle on both Twitter and Instagram. Thank you for listening.